Hi, welcome back to Add Your Faith Ministries Synoptic Gospel Study. My name is Elizabeth Lenu Bardhan, and today we're going to be continuing with our study of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and having a full understanding of what happened during Jesus' trials. Now, I find that this is such an interesting thing to research and to look into because we don't always understand culturally what is happening during Jesus' trials. We may not know the laws of Israel, the laws of Rome, the cultural concepts of the Sanhedrin, all these things that are happening that the readers of the Gospels, when they were written, would have understood the context and the implication. But we might miss those things. So I've enjoyed researching that and looking into that today. And I'm going to be looking at all four Gospels accounts of the trials, which is Matthew chapter 26, verses 57 to 68, Mark chapter 14, verses 53 to 65, Luke chapter 22, verses 54 to 55, and also 63 to 71, and then John 18, verses 13 to 14 and 19 to 21. Now, what I really enjoyed reading, what I found super interesting. First, I read through all the four gospel accounts chronologically. And then as I was researching, I came across this book called Jesus Christ, The Greatest Life. And in this book, the author harmonized all the Gospels into one smooth account and used the words of the four Gospels only. He added nothing to it and didn't leave anything out, but just layered them in a chronological time order so that we can understand exactly what's happening without any confusion. And I found that really helpful, so I'll be reading in that way. But first of all, Jesus had 6 different trials, and I don't think we always realize that, of exactly what was happening at this time. Now, last week we were talking about when Judas betrayed Christ and he came with all these weapons, which was an illegal approach, and they took Jesus as if he was a criminal despite all of his public preaching, which is what he said. He's like, I've always been preaching in public. Why are you coming to me in secret like I'm a robber? Since that was the only reason you could have weapons was to go against robbers. So them coming armed was a very serious offense against the law. We talked about that all last week. So, and what we're looking at today is also a lot of illegal activity by the Sanhedrin. And I don't think I really realized that so much when I was reading the accounts chronologically. And not chronologically, when I was reading the accounts through the order of the Gospels, the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John order, I was confused in reading it because each account is about a different trial. And if you think it's all one trial, then people get really confused. Like, why did Jesus say he is the Christ in this one, but in this one he didn't answer? Why are the Gospels not harmonizing? Why are they different? It's not that the Gospels aren't harmonizing. Harmonizing means matching the story. They weren't disagreeing with each other. They're giving different accounts of things that happened to Christ in the 6 different trials that he experienced on this night of his arrest. Now, it's going to be a lot of material, but let's see if we can get it done in one video. I don't know, I may have to make it 2. Alright, so first of all, the 6 trials. The first one started at 1 o'clock in the morning. This was the preliminary hearing before Annas, and we'll break all these down with the scriptures in just a minute, but just giving you the outline. That's given the account in John 18. A trial before dawn was illegal in Jewish law. Annas uses the opportunity to find out who Jesus' disciples were, perhaps to find out who else they could arrest. Now, I am reading from an author who, as I said, posted from the Jesus Christ, The Greatest Life. And if you want, I can post some of that information on the video. But they just outline the timing and what was happening at each trial. So that was trial number 1. Trial number 2 was at 3 o'clock in the morning. Again, remember, it's illegal to have any trials during the night by Sanhedrin law. Now, there's a difference between biblical law and Sanhedrin law, but for the Jews, there wasn't a big difference between those 2 things. They had to follow the legal code that God gave in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, but they also had to follow the rules and guidelines that were established in what is called the Talmud. These were the writings of all the high priests and major leaders of the Sanhedrin throughout their history who gave guidelines on how to apply God's laws to stay holy. And it's what Jesus criticized them for, that they were adding such burden to people on what it meant to be righteous while they themselves were not following all that law, which is really exemplified in Jesus' trials, because they have every single thing they did was illegal by the Talmud. So they are breaking all of their own laws in the way that they are trying Jesus and convicting him to death. So the second trial at 3 a.m. is before Caiaphas the high priest and the Sanhedrin. This trial was also illegal. They used the opportunity to throw as many charges at Jesus as possible in order to find a charge that will stick. Once they have this, they can take Jesus to the Romans. And another article I was reading called The 6 Illegal Trials of Jesus pointed out that the Sanhedrin itself had no legal authority to prosecute crime. So they were trying to trap Jesus into saying something that they could then use against him before the Romans. So this was very much an entrapment situation. It was an illegal trial that was not supposed to be happening at night. There was also other issues that we'll get into possibly later, but I want to mention now just so I don't forget. By the Sanhedrin law, you were never supposed to be tried before one judge. And in this case, he's only before the high priest. The rest of the Sanhedrin were present, but they were not judging. And you were supposed to be before a panel of 6 judges, and one of them had to be acting as the defense of the accused. So that means for proper Sanhedrin law, there should have been 6 judges that were presented a case by an outside person who brought to them this attack on Jesus, accusing him of something. And then they would listen to at least 2 witnesses who agreed to the testimony of the accuser, and they would decide if this person had committed this crime or not, while one of the judges would have to find defense for the accused. So there should have been a judge defending Jesus, while 6 judges were listening to the accounts of witnesses. Now, this did not happen. Again, this is an illegal trial. 1 priest and false witnesses, none of them agreed with each other. There had to be at least 2 who agreed. None of them did. And you just see this whole framework of illegality where they used their twisted religious zeal to justify doing something evil. They hated Jesus so much. They were so terrified by what he represented. One side was afraid that he would become the king, that he was the Messiah, that he would overthrow Rome and would throw all of the Jewish community and authority into chaos. The other side, in their religious zeal, thought Jesus was blaspheming, that he was not the Messiah, and that they therefore had the right to persecute and torture him because of not agreeing with his religious approach. Either one is evil. Either side is very twisted. And that's one of the first application points that I want to make out of this today, is how easy it is in religion to become so twisted that we justify evil acts by focusing on what we're saying the other person is doing wrong rather than saying what we're doing wrong ourselves. Jesus had done nothing wrong. No witnesses could agree. It was all false witnesses, lies, illegal trials, biased judges, breaking all their laws, and yet they were determined to put Jesus to death. And that's another point, is that you could not put someone to death in one day. The judge would have to take the trial in one day, and it had to be at least the next day before the accused was crucified. And they did not do that correctly. They turned him over to Rome within that same day. So it's, again, just all this repeated breaking of their law. I think it's imperative for our understanding of Jesus's choice to redeem us, that he allowed these things to happen, as we know, because he is our Savior. However, from a human perspective, and the Jewish people today who still reject Jesus as Messiah and look at these trials as legitimate, it is important that we see the truths of what was happening and be careful ourselves to never get biased or filled with hate or twisted to where we feel like we are allowed, justified, or even empowered to do evil ourselves. And I may talk about that more later, but let's go ahead and continue. So trial 1 was before Annas. Trial 2 was before the high priest and the Sanhedrin at 3 a.m. At 6 a.m., this is the first one that's barely legal because the sun has just come up and it had to be daylight before it was legal. So they had done these 2 trials during the night trying to gather information to what they were going to accuse Jesus of, what the crime was, and then they had a legal assembly at 6 a.m. And my notes here say, before the high priest and the whole Sanhedrin at 6 o'clock in the morning, as recorded in Luke chapter 22, verse 66. This trial is barely legal, taking place after the first blush of sunrise. They assembled the full Sanhedrin to make their findings during the night official, according to Jewish law. So they're trying to check the boxes of matching the law, even though what they did is unjustifiable. They were breaking their own law. Now they're trying to come back around and have a legal gathering at 6 a.m. Now at 7 o'clock in the morning is when Jesus was taken before Pilate the first time, as recorded in John 18:28, and Pilate finds Jesus innocent and sends him to Herod. At 8 a.m., Jesus is before Herod Antipas, the ruler of Galilee. Herod wants to see Jesus perform miracles like magic tricks. When he won't, Herod sends him back to Pilate. Now at 9 a.m., Jesus is standing before Pilate again, and Pilate once again finds Jesus innocent. But because he was afraid of a riot from the Jewish leaders, he condemned him to death. Now, I want to read through these harmonized accounts of what occurred and the order it occurred in. And the reason I, again, am emphasizing this is when you read like the Matthew account, in Matthew chapter 26, they say, "Are you the Christ?" And Jesus said, "You have said so." And then in Mark 14, when they ask, "Are you the Christ?" Jesus says, "I am." But in Luke 22, when they ask, "Are you the Christ?" he says, "If I tell you, you will not believe. And if I ask you, you won't answer." And they said, "You will tell us if you are the Christ." He said, "You say that I am." And then in John 18, only records the main trial with Annas in the first section. And in the second section, in John 18:19-24, it explains a completely different conversation with Jesus and the high priest. And so that's why it's so easy to get confused, and that people accuse Jesus of not defending himself at all, of denying that he is the Christ, or they'll go the other way and they'll just say, well, the Gospels are obviously not true because they don't match. And none of that is correct. Jesus actually did defend himself correctly, legally, and obviously morally. And then, but also the whole point that the Gospels themselves are not being revealed as inaccurate because of the different stories. It is the 6 different trials that are being recorded, and so there's different conversations happening. So Jesus is giving different answers at different times, and we read it all together, then we get that full, clear image of what's happening. So that's how we're going to read it. This is the section on the first trial, the preliminary hearing before Annas, the former high priest. This is from Matthew 26:57, Mark 14:53, Luke 22:54, the first part, John 18:12-14, and 19:24. And again, this is putting those, only the scriptural words, but putting them together in a harmonized way. So then the cohort of soldiers and the chief captain and the officers of the Jews took and bound Jesus. They led him away first to Annas because he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. It was Caiaphas who had advised the Jews that it would be prudent for one man to die for the people. The high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus answered him, "I spoke openly to the world. I always taught in the synagogues and in the temple where all the Jews assemble. I said nothing in secret. Why do you question me? Question those who heard me. They know what I said." When he said this, one of the officers standing nearby struck Jesus in the face. "Is this the way you answer the high priest?" he demanded. "If I spoke wrongly," Jesus answered, "explain my error. But if I have spoken rightly, why do you strike me?" All right, so that is about that first trial. Now, I want to focus on something about Caiaphas here that I found super interesting. When it says in John that Caiaphas had been the one who advised the Jews that it would be prudent for one man to die for the people, that is from John chapter 11. So if you'll look over there, in John chapter 11, verses 49 to 52 is when we learn about this Caiaphas and his ideas. So I'm going to start in 45. "Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what he did, believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. So the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered in the council and said, 'What are we to do? For this man performs many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation.' But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, 'You know nothing at all, nor do you understand that it is better for you that one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish.' He did not say this of his own accord, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but also to gather into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. So from that day on, they made plans to put him to death." Now, so this is the conspiracy that Caiaphas starts at this point in the timeline, which is recorded in John 11, that we're seeing coming to fruition in Jesus' actual trials. And it's just so interesting that Caiaphas is, I love it that he's like not intentionally, like accidentally prophesying. God used his position as high priest to speak through him, despite the fact that he was not godly, that Jesus needed to die for the nation. But he was not saying this in a Messiah sort of way. What he meant was, let's use Jesus and kill one person instead of allowing him to bring disrupt to our nation. Was to say the Romans are going to come and take away our power and our place and not our power, can take away our place in our nation. That idea of their position, their place being messed up, and their nation being under attack of Rome, he's saying, let's avoid war and just kill one person. Let's just kill Jesus. Now, obviously, it is never good to kill a person, even for the greater good, and which is what he is proposing. However, it's interesting that in his evil thought, God communicates through him the real plan, that Jesus would die for the whole nation. Not just to save them from war, but to save them from their sins, which I just find such a beautiful way that God still works through any instrument, any person in authority. God can still speak through them and communicate despite what they think they're saying and what they actually intend, that God can still use it for his glory, which is pretty awesome. It's very awesome. All right, let's look at the second trial. The second trial, the hearing before Caiaphas, is recorded in Matthew 26, 59 to 68, Mark 14, 55 to 65, and Luke 22, 63 to 65. Then Annas sent him, still bound, to Caiaphas the high priest. Those who had seized Jesus led him away to the high priest's house, where all the chief priests and the elders and the teachers of the law had gathered. The chief priests and the elders and the entire Sanhedrin kept trying to find false witnesses to testify against Jesus in order to execute him. They could find none. Though many false witnesses came forward to accuse him, their testimony did not agree. Let me just stop there and point out, one, that the chief priests and elders and the entire Sanhedrin are all working together to find false witnesses. Like they knew they were looking for false witnesses. It was a conspiracy in the sense that they're looking not for truth, not for real witnesses, but false witnesses. How easy it is in a religious setting that has lost their perspective on truth and on God to become so corrupt and twisted that they're actually looking for false witnesses. And then the next part that I want to focus on, the point that none of the witnesses agreed. Again, Jewish law, you have to have two people agreeing about the crime before it could be prosecuted. It was a way to avoid someone, his word against my word type thing. It had to be witnessed by two people before the Sanhedrin could prosecute it. Now, Let's continue reading. At last, two stepped forward and spoke against him. We heard this man say, I'll destroy the temple of God, made by human hands, and in 3 days I'll build another, not made by human hands. But even then, their statements did not agree. So the high priest stood up before them and questioned Jesus. Do you refuse to answer? He demanded. What is this they're accusing you of? But Jesus was silent and made no answer. Once more the high priest said to him, Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? I charge you under oath by the living God. Tell us whether you're the Messiah, the Son of God. It's just as you have said, Jesus answered, I am. Furthermore, I tell all of you that later on you will see the Son of Man sitting by the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. That quote is why I find it interesting that people say Jesus said nothing at all to defend himself or never said he was the Messiah. Clearly, Jesus states who he is. He uses the title, I am. All of this was a very clear statement of his messianic power. Son of Man being a title that's used for the Messiah. So what did the high priest do? Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, He has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Listen, you have heard his blasphemy. What do you think? He deserves to die, they answered. Everyone condemned him as deserving death, which was not the right penalty for blasphemy. Another illegal point was that they had policies for blasphemy, and that was not it. So, except in rare cases, and it had to be in trial for several times and everything else we've talked about. So, an interesting way that they all agreed together. Now, let's skip on down. Just a second. Some of them began to spit on his face and strike him with their fists. The men who were holding Jesus began to mock him. After they had blindfolded him, they kept slapping his face and taunting him. Prophesy, they said. Prophesy to us, you Messiah, who just struck you. And they said many other insulting things to him. All right, now the third trial before the Sanhedrin is from Matthew chapter 27, verses 1 to 2, Mark 15:1, and Luke 22:66 to 23. As soon as daylight came, all the elders of the people, both the chief priests and the teachers of the law, met together against Jesus to execute him. They brought him up to the whole Sanhedrin and said, If you are the Messiah, tell us. He said to them, If I were to tell you, you would certainly not believe. And if I were to ask the questions, you would not answer me or let me go. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated by the right hand of the power of God. So you are the Son of God, they all said. It's just as you say, he replied, because I am. Again, in all caps, as the title of God, I am. Why do we need further witnesses, they said. We have heard it ourselves from his own mouth. Then the whole crowd arose and tied up Jesus and took him to appear before Pontius Pilate, the governor. It's so interesting to me the way Jesus responds. If I were to tell you, you would certainly not believe. And if I were to ask the questions, you would not answer me or let me go. Jesus is so infinitely wise as God. It's so interesting. Our motivation for why we tell something is important. If you are the Messiah, tell us, they demanded. And he said, if I told you, you wouldn't believe. And if I ask questions, like if I ask this question to you, you wouldn't answer me. Now, why? I'm going to look into, before we go to the fourth trial, another article that I have that is such a beautifully well stated. This is by Robert Clifton Robinson on the 6 Illegal Trials of Jesus. And he said, It has been my personal opinion that when Jesus refused to answer the high priest and Pilate, he had done so because he was representing you and I at the trial of our sins. Because we are guilty and can offer no defense for our actions, Jesus therefore said nothing. As we examine Jesus' silence from a legal standpoint, we may also conjecture that Jesus did not answer the high priest because he was aware of the law that he was not required to answer to incriminate himself. You have the right to remain silent is a common Miranda right that people know in America, that they do not have to incriminate themselves. And the reason they were asking these questions of Jesus is they wanted him to incriminate themselves so they could take him before the Roman leaders and have something to accuse him of. And so Jesus is wording his answers so carefully so that they cannot twist it and say that he confessed to something that they could then say he had done something illegal to Rome. So instead, they had to completely make up false statements to Rome rather than having something they could state. So just the wisdom of Christ there is so beautiful. All right, let's go on to the fourth trial. Matthew 27, verses 11 to 14. Mark chapter 15, verses 2 to 5. Luke chapter 23, verses 2 to 3. And from John chapter 18, verses 28 to 38. Then the Jews led Jesus from Caiaphas to the Roman judgment hall, where Jesus stood before the governor. Because it was early, they did not go into the judgment hall. They didn't want to become defiled and be unable to eat the Passover. There's another law issue there in the Talmud. You're never supposed to judge someone on the Sabbath. That's court's not open on the Sabbath. This was the highest Sabbath of the year. Passover is exceptionally important. And they didn't want to defile themselves. Like, guys, everything you've just done this evening is illegal. You have defiled your own law and God's law multiple times, but you don't want to defile yourselves. We as human beings can justify so much evil if we allow ourselves, to where we think we're still religiously pure while we're living ungodly lives. And that is such a dangerous walk that is important that we challenge and that we pray over our lives, that God would reveal anything in us that is hidden from us, that is where we think of ourselves again as being good for church, but ignore a lifestyle of sinfulness. They have defiled themselves so many times, but they were concerned they wouldn't be able to eat Passover if they walked into the Roman court. It's such a sad twisting of what God was giving in the Old Testament that they have misused and added to with the Talmud, which God says not to do, resulting in this evil religious zeal that's so twisted and justifying evil. So they didn't want to become defiled and be unable to eat Passover. I think it's so significant that God put that in, showing us the motivation of their heart and the confusion that they were justifying and living in. So Pilate went out to them. Of what are you accusing this man? He asked them. If he were not a criminal, they answered, we wouldn't have brought him to you. Such an indirect answer. Why'd you bring him? Well, if there wasn't a problem, we wouldn't be here. They didn't actually give the good, he did this. They speak sarcastically. Take him and judge him according to your law, Pilate replied. We aren't permitted to execute anyone, the Jews responded. In this way, they were fulfilling what Jesus said about the kind of death he would suffer. They began accusing him, saying, we found this man subverting our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar. He says he's the Messiah, a king. Again, this is a false accusation. Jesus never said that. Opposite-wise, he always said to give unto Caesar what Caesar deserves. The chief priests and elders continued making many accusations against Jesus, but he made no reply. Do you refuse to answer? Pilate says. Don't you hear how many accusations they're charging you with? Jesus remained silent, not answering a single charge. The governor was astonished. Pilate then went back to the judgment hall and called Jesus. Are you the king of the Jews? He asked him. Jesus replied, It's just as you say. Are you asking this on your own, or did others tell you about me? Am I a Jew? Pilate answered. Your own nation and the chief priests hand you over to me. What have you done? Jesus said, My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But at present, my kingdom is not from here. Then you really are a king? Pilate said. Jesus answered, It's just as you say. I am a king. I was born for this. And for this I came into the world, so I might testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth hears my voice. What is truth? Pilate asked. Jesus' fifth trial was his hearing before Herod Antipas, which is recorded in Luke 23, verses 4 to 12, and John 18:38. After saying this, Pilate went out again to the Jews and said to the chief priests and the crowds, I find this man guilty of nothing. But they strongly insisted. He is stirring up the people. He's teaching throughout Judea, starting from Galilee and reaching even to this place. When Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. On learning that he was from the jurisdiction of Herod, he sent him up to Herod, who happened to be in Jerusalem at that time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was quite pleased. For a long time he had wanted to see him, since he had heard many reports about him and hoped to see him perform some miracle. He probed him with many questions, but Jesus didn't answer them, even though the priests and the teachers of the law stood there viciously accusing him. After Herod and his soldiers had ridiculed and mocked him, they clothed him in gaudy robe and sent him back to Pilate. From that day on, Pilate and Herod became friends. Before this, they did not get along. Such a random spot of information there. And then Jesus' sixth trial, the final hearing before Pilate, is from Matthew 27:15-31, Mark 15:6-20, Luke 23:13-25, and John 18:39 and 19:16. Then Pilate called together the chief priests and the rulers of the people and said to them, "You brought this man to me on the charge of stirring up subversion. Yet, on examining him, I found no substance to your accusations. Neither did Herod, because he sent him back to us. You can see he's done nothing deserving death. Now you have a custom directing me to release one man to you at Passover. So I'll punish him and then release him." At the feast, the governor's custom was to release one prisoner to the people, whomever they chose. At that time, a notable prisoner named Barabbas was being held along with a few of his fellow insurgents. He was a robber who had been thrown into prison for an insurrection in the city and for murder. When the crowds had gathered and noisily asked Pilate to act on the custom, he answered, "Whom do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Messiah?" He knew the chief priests had handed Jesus over because of envy, and as he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him, "Don't do anything to that just man. On account of him, I have suffered many things in a dream." But the chief priests and the elders stirred up the crowds to ask Pilate to release Barabbas to them instead and to execute Jesus. "Which of the two do you want me to release to you?" the governor said. "Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" They replied, "Barabbas." They all shouted together, "Not this man, get rid of him, and give us Barabbas." Because Pilate wanted to release Jesus, he said to them once more, "Then what should I do with Jesus, who is called Messiah, whom you call King of the Jews?" They all shouted, "Let him be crucified." They continued crying out, "Crucify, crucify him." For the third time, Pilate said to them, "Why? What evil has he done? I don't find that he's done anything deserving death. So after punishing him, I'll release him." Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers took thorns, wove them into a crown, and placed it on his head. They put a purple garment on him and said, "Hail, King of the Jews," and kept punching him with their fists. Pilate then came out again and said to them, "Look, I am bringing him out to you, so you'll know I find him not guilty." Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple garment. "Look at the man," Pilate said to them. When the chief priests and the officers saw him, they shouted, "Crucify, crucify." "You take him and crucify him yourself," Pilate said. "I find him not guilty." "We have a law," the Jews answered, "and by our law he ought to die because he claimed to be the Son of God." When Pilate heard this claim, he grew even more afraid. He returned to the judgment hall and said to Jesus, "Where do you come from?" Jesus gave no answer. "You refuse to talk to me," Pilate said. "Don't you know I have authority to crucify you or to release you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no authority at all over me unless it had been given to you from above. Because of this, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of the greater sin." These words prompted Pilate to continue seeking ways to release him. But the Jews shouted, "If you release this man, you're no friend of Caesar. Anyone claiming to be the king is speaking against Caesar." Hearing this, Pilate brought Jesus outside. He sat down on the judgment seat in a place called the Pavement, or in the Jewish language, Gabbatha. It was preparation day for the Passover, about 6 a.m. He said to the Jews, "Look at your king." But they shouted, away with him, crucify him." They were insistent and shouted all the more, demanding loudly that he be crucified. Pilate said to them, "Should I crucify your king?" "We have no king," the chief priests answered, "except Caesar." When Pilate saw he couldn't dissuade them, but instead a riot was in the making, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd and said, "I'm innocent of the blood of the righteous man. You will be witnesses of the fact." All the people answered, "His blood be on us and our children." Wow, Oof, that's rough. Their voices and those of the chief priests won out. So Pilate, wanting to satisfy the crowd, ordered that they should get what they demanded. He released Barabbas to them, the man they had asked for, who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, but he gave in to their demands about Jesus and handed him over to be crucified. Then the governor's soldiers took Jesus and led him away to the court called the Praetorium. There they gathered the whole company of soldiers around him. They stripped him, then again clothed him in purple, and put a crimson cloak on him. And they put on his head the crown of thorns they had made, and placed a reed in his right hand. They continued mocking him, bowing in homage and saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They spat on him and took the reed from him and kept beating him on his head. When they finished ridiculing him, the soldiers stripped him of the cloak and the purple garments and gave him his own clothing. Then they led him out to crucify him. Now again, this harmonizing of the four Gospels being put together into this, I find, very clarifying way of putting the verses together, is from Jesus Christ, The Greatest Life, a unique blending of the four Gospels, which was published in 1999 by Johnston M. Cheney, Stanley A. Ellison, and Johnston M. Cheney. Why is his name on there twice? Anyway, I have not read the book. I don't know what else it is, but I'm really happy to come across this today, because I think when we just read the Gospels by order of their appearance, it's very easy to miss concepts and to not understand what's happening. But having them harmonized like this makes it so much more clear. Now, I know I've already went a long time today. If you're still with me at this point, wow, I'm excited that you are still listening. But I want to just focus on the prophecies that we see fulfilled in this occurrence of all these illegal trials and evil twisting of the religious men that resulted in Jesus going to the cross. But as Jesus said, it wouldn't happen without God's permission. God allowed this to happen for our sakes. And as I read from the 6 Illegal Trials of Jesus article, that Jesus was standing trial for us. We have no defense for our sinfulness, and so Jesus said nothing. I think that's such an interesting and beautiful concept that explains so much about what was happening at this time. So if you look, we have two main passages that are really referred to as these prophecies. The first is in Psalm chapter 27, verse 12. And that says, "Give me not up to the will of my adversaries, for false witnesses have risen against me, and they breathe out violence." Okay, so we see that fulfilled in this. And then, of course, the key passage that we always go to for prophecies about the crucifixion is Isaiah 53. And the entire chapter is so intensely clear of what was going on the cross. But if you look specifically at chapter 53, verse 8, let's start at 7. "He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people." Now, if you jump down, excuse me, to 9, "And they made his grave with the wicked, and with a rich man in his death, although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. When his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offering, and he shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand." And jump down again. "Because he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors, yet he bore the sin of many and makes intercession for the transgressors." Now, of course, that one we looked at last week. But again, this was what was happening. Jesus knew what his trial was supposed to look like when he inspired this writing of Isaiah. And in this clarity that we see how the Jewish leaders were doing all this evil, when we see how Jesus responded, he was careful knowing the law, He was accurate in what he said. He was wise, but he was also silent, because that matched the prophecies. So I hope that looking at all these today and reading it in this way helps you to have a clear understanding of what can be a lot of information in a confusing passage, and that you can take away from this today some just a better and deeper understanding of everything that that Jesus experienced for us. That the reason he was silent, the reason his arguments were so careful, everything that he did was with us as the intention. He knew, as he said to Pilate, that it was for this that I was born. The reason Jesus came to the earth was to be sacrificed for the transgressions of the people, as Isaiah clarifies. Jesus was not accidentally crucified. It didn't surprise God when that happened. It didn't surprise Jesus. He had been prophesying for several chapters that this was going to happen. He had been warning the disciples that he was going to be taken away. The twisted witness testimony that used Jesus' words about how he was going to destroy the temple and build it up in 3 days, he was talking about himself. It was a prophecy of this crucifixion that would then be resurrected. So, beautiful stuff. It's such a glorious thing to see how God has recorded the historical events, the cultural aspects, the legal ramifications of everything going on around the trials of Christ that led up to the crucifixion that he took in our place. If you have any questions or confusions or thoughts you'd like to share, I'm always open to receiving your messages and your comments. Feel free to let me know. Be praying that everyone who's participating in the video today has real clarity on this, and look forward to talking to you next week. All right, bye-bye.